Tonight, a ceasefire on life support and a region bracing for what comes next. The April 7th truce is nearing its end with no extension confirmed and talks in disarray. Iran is still weighing whether to attend negotiations in Pakistan as the U.S. maintains its port blockade and Tehran questions Washington's commitment. Tensions spiked after the U.S. seized the Iranian flagship Tosca following a 6-hour standoff. Iran called it armed piracy and vowed retaliation, while China urged restraint. Oil has jumped about 5% and traffic through the Strait of Hormuz remains disrupted. Elsewhere, violence continues. In Gaza, more than 750 Palestinians have been killed since the ceasefire took effect. In Lebanon, on the other hand, nearly 2,300 people have died since fighting resumed on March 2nd, despite a U.S.-mediated ceasefire. Economic risks are rising as well. The IMF warns of a possible global recession, projecting oil at $110 a barrel in 2026 and $125 a barrel in 2027, while sharply cutting Middle East growth forecast. Tonight, we ask the hard questions. Is this a path to peace or the countdown to a wider war the global economy cannot afford? This question and more are put to my panel tonight on All 24 News Special. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another special on All 24 News, All 24 News special series. And of course, before we bring in our guests, let's just follow these reports by Zahra Fragility, and then we come back to the discussion.
Hours before the ceasefire deadline, uncertainty is growing over the future of U.S.-Iran talks. Iran says it still has no plan to join the next round of talks with the United States in Islamabad, casting doubt over efforts to de-escalate tensions. Tehran is accusing Washington of violating the ceasefire, pointing to a continued naval blockade and what it describes as hostile actions, a key reason behind its hesitation to return to negotiations. Iranian media say the blockade remains a major obstacle, while recent exchanges reflect deep disagreements and what Tehran calls excessive demands. A senior Iranian official also told Reuters that its missile program is not up for negotiation, with disputes over the nuclear file still unresolved. Still, President Masoud Pezeshkian is calling for diplomacy carefully.
Honoring commitments is the basis of meaningful dialogue. Deep historical mistrust in Iran toward U.S. government conduct remains, while unconstructive and contradictory signals from American officials carry a bitter message. They seek Iran's surrender. Iranians do not submit to force.
All this comes as a 2-week ceasefire expires on Wednesday, with no clear direction for what comes next. On the U.S. side, President Donald Trump says he is not under pressure to reach a deal, but insists one could come relatively quickly.
I have no problem meeting them if they want to meet, and we have some very capable people. I'm not under pressure, but we will have a deal relatively quickly. It has to be the right deal.
A U.S. delegation led by Vice President J.D. Vance is expected to travel to Pakistan soon in an effort to revive talks. But with Iran still undecided and the next phase of negotiations unclear, the situation remains on edge as the ceasefire clock runs out.
All right, let's start debating. To unpack these fast-moving developments, I'm joined tonight by a distinguished panel. Ms. Zahra Ladha joins us from London. She's a Middle East analyst and political risk specialist. Ms. Ladha, welcome.
Hi, thank you very much for having me this evening.
Our pleasure. And also we're joined by Mr. Jisu Antonio Baez. He's with us from London as well. He's a managing director of Pax Taxum Global. Hello, sir, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
The pleasure is all ours. And also, we're pleasure to have Dr. Charles Salvadon, who joins us from Geneva. He's a professor, geopolitics expert, and author, and also working at the Ardifridi Institute. Dr. Salvadon, welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
It's our pleasure, really. And also, we're pleasure to have Dr. Faisal Javaid, who is with us from Islamabad at a very early hour in the morning. He's an expert in Eurasian geopolitics and regional connectivity. Dr. Javaid, it's good to have you with us. All right, so let's begin with the first question directed to you, Ms. Zahra Ladha. So we're just, let's say, a few hours from the ceasefire deadline. The U.S. delegation is expected in Islamabad, but Reuters is saying Iran is still considering whether to attend. Tehran has pointed to the U.S. blockade and the seizure of the Tosca as major obstacle. Now, from a political risk perspective, how do you assess the current state of negotiations? Is this a genuine diplomatic process, or has the U.S. blockade turned what should be a negotiation between equals into what Tehran increasingly views as a surrender ceremony?
Absolutely, and it's a very pertinent point. These are real negotiations, but the Trump administration appears to be more insistent on finding the conditions for the optics of surrender than actually finding a deal with Tehran. And this is a major impediment both to the resumption of negotiations and the success of these talks should they resume. You mentioned the seizure of the Iranian vessel over the last few days. As we've already seen, this has caused an impediment to the resumption of talks. But even if talks do remain, the core issue remains the same. If the Trump administration insists on framing this deal as Iranian capitulation or surrender, this may well cost him the entire deal with the Iranians. And we could see this play out with the US side kind of insisting that Iran transfers its enriched uranium abroad, or any kind of action that makes the Iranians perceive such a deal as not a deal between equals, but Iran's and in their words, humiliation on the international stage. This moves us further away from a deal and actually more closer to resumed hostilities between the two states.
Mm-hmm. But then, Ms. Zahra Ladha, Iran's foreign ministry is saying U.S. proposals have been unserious and its demands unrealistic. So given that Iran has now twice in 1 week opened and then closed the Strait of Hormuz, what kind of signal is Iran sending about its willingness to negotiate under blockade conditions?
Yeah, absolutely. But I would say that the Iranians would say that they've been negotiating under at least economic blockade conditions since the talks last year, or even further back. The Iranians have showed that they are willing to negotiate. They do want some concessions when it does come to access to kind of exports and their economic leverage. I mean, we saw Iranian officials say before the first round of talks in Islamabad that they wanted their assets unfrozen as a prerequisite to talks occurring. Of course, this didn't happen, but we're seeing the Iranians saying, look, we're willing to negotiate, but some concessions need to be made, especially economically, before we engage. So the real issue isn't whether the Iranians are willing to negotiate under this current framework, but it's whether they assess that the Americans are willing to adhere or respect at least some of Iran's red lines. And there are some indications that this is the case. Since the ceasefire was enacted around 2 weeks ago, we've seen very little mention of Iran's ballistic missile program. And if you cast your minds back to when these negotiations first began in February, this was a core sticking point between the US administration and the Iranians. So if we see any movement towards the US kind of respecting at least some of Iran's demands in these negotiations, the Iranians appear more than willing to negotiate.
Mm-hmm. So you've been raising very fundamental questions of whether one can negotiate while a blockade remains in place. And here, let me bring Mr. Baiz technically on the incident that has brought this tension to a head. Mr. Jason Antonio Baiz, Reuters is saying the U.S. military disabled the engines of an Iranian-flagged cargo ship after a 6-hour standoff, and Marines boarded the vessel. President Donald Trump said U.S. forces stopped the ship right in their tracks, while Iran called it armed piracy and promised retaliation. Now, from your expertise in conflict management, how do you assess these escalations? Is this standard blockade enforcement, or does firing on a civilian merchant vessel under nominal ceasefire cross a threshold that fundamentally changes the character of this confrontation?
I mean, we can clearly say that it's definitely not a standard procedure. I mean, from a conflict management perspective, it's an evident escalation. There's no other way to put it. I mean, you're seeing a shift from deterrence going straight to what's called compellence instead. And so it's raising the risk of the retaliation cycle. Iran has signaled its response already to retaliate. And here we go again with creating a classic escalation dynamic. So we're going back to almost like a tit-for-tat kind of scenario. So in regard to the threshold has very much been crossed. It's beyond been crossed. We're entering a whole different dynamic. I mean, firing into the engine room of a civilian and an underlying civilian flag vessel, again, that's not routine enforcement. It's deliberate disabling. And under a ceasefire, that shifts it completely again from deterrence, again into direct escalation. Now, this is not a surprise. I mean, particularly with this administration, there have been hundreds and countless of instances in which it's been crossing a line, not just in wartime, but in diplomacy, in ally engagement, in trade, security. I mean, the best way to describe it is almost simply taking paper and tossing it into the air, because unfortunately anything goes at this point. And that's what's making it so dangerous, because the unpredictability is becoming the norm. And from colleagues that I have in DC, they tell me that when anybody asks to try to understand what the strategic intent is with the administration, they laugh, because it says it shifts. They're unable even themselves after years working in this type of dynamic to ascertain where it's going. So it's a very dangerous precedent for our security and for even understanding longevity of a ceasefire or any longevity of peace.
Mm-hmm. But that's not the only incident. Let's recall that President Donald Trump has threatened to destroy every bridge and power plant in Iran. And Iranian officials are saying those threats could amount to war crimes. So does the combination of the Tosca seizure and these threats against civilian infrastructure indicate that Washington is generally seeking a negotiated settlement, or is it pursuing a maximum coercion designed to force capitulation rather than compromise?
I mean, the most important thing to understand, it's about showing strength and showing who's boss. That's definitely the approach of the Trump administration overall. It's about coherence and not compromise. Now, does the administration want to have a negotiated settlement? Of course, but as long as it makes the administration look stronger and more powerful, and therefore, as a result, it will always use maximum coercion in order to get what it wants. And that's the nature of the president. That's part of his whole art of the deal, and been his ethos since time memorial. It's been using maximum pressure, escalate, create leverage, and then negotiate from there. It's negotiating from strength, and that's his perceptive. And this is, again, we saw this last year with Liberation Day, of the tariffs, the way the administration is engaging with allies on all fronts. So again, yes, it wants a deal, but it has to look dominant. It has to be able to look like it has all the cards in its hands, and it's the one really manning the control. So it's part of their strategy. It's just to be dominant, to be strong, and not let go until they have it in their hands.
Mm-hmm. So let me turn now to Dr. Salvadon. Dr. Salvadon, let's just step back a little and examine the strategic logic behind this approach. If we come to look at it, the U.S. is demanding that Iran hand over all of its nuclear material, a demand Tehran calls unrealistic. Iran says it cannot forget U.S. attacks during previous diplomatic talks. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump says the deal he is actually offering is very fair and reasonable, while threatening Iranian infrastructure if Tehran refuses. Now, from a geopolitical perspective, how do you assess the U.S. negotiating strategy? Is this a good faith diplomatic process, or is Washington demanding terms that no sovereign state could actually or reasonably accept?
It's a really good question. I mean, at the end of the day, this is not classic diplomacy. It's a coercive negotiation. The US is setting, terms that looks less like a compromise and more like a strategic surrender, which no sovereign state is likely to accept. Even if an agreement is reached, if it comes after potentially unlawful use of force, it will suffer from a serious legitimacy deficit and may not hold over time. This is at some point the conclusion I can give you. So I mean the situation is not really optimistic at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Salvador, if we come to read articles and analysis on think tanks and so on, we find, for example, Dr. Ramzi Baroud, in a widely discussed analysis, he asks what he calls the most obvious question liberal media refuses to ask, that the war itself is criminal and justifiable and illegal under international law. And the aggression, particularly while negotiations, I'm saying, are underway, was ethically indefensible. Do you agree with this assessment? And if the war itself was illegal under international law, what legitimacy can any ceasefire agreement negotiated under its shadow possibly claim?
What we are saying in geopolitics, speech. There is no, fairness, unfairness, bad, good sides. I mean, everybody at the moment doesn't really care about, international law. This is what we can see at some point. From a couple of months now, and I would say more than a year. If we go back to Ukraine war, Russia didn't care about international law. The US at some point has the same behavior. So the problem is for tomorrow. We need to reshape from scratch this framework, because it's quite dangerous for everybody, and we need to rebuild a United Nations model to respect some rules, some diplomacy rules. That was at the end of the day, what was the Westphalia Agreement, to create an international framework and some rules to respect. So at the moment, we do not have anything. Everybody is doing what he wants, and this is clearly the danger.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Dr. Salvador. Now, let me turn to Dr. Javaid. And by this doing, we're going to turn to the country that brought these two adversaries to the same table and the risks it now faces. So, Dr. Faisal Javaid, Pakistan has emerged as the central mediator in this conflict, hosting the highest level US-Iran engagement in years. But then Reuters says the Iranian side is still undecided, while Islamabad is preparing heavily for talks that may not even happen. Pakistani officials are now caught in an impossible position, hosting a negotiation where one party may not show up and where the other party is simultaneously enforcing a naval blockade and seizing the other side's ships. From your expertise in Eurasian geopolitics and regional connectivity, what are the risks for Pakistan if this mediation collapses? And another question, how does Islamabad's role as mediator position it in the broader regional competition between US-led and China-led visions of Asian connectivity, let's say?
Thank you so much. Yes, as you discussed about, Iranian side is not confirming that because U.S. delegation maybe reach today in Pakistan time, So Iranian side have concerns because as you already take question, U.S. Just got the ship, and Iranian have a condition, put the condition, U.S. should end the blockade, and because the Strait of Hormuz will be open. Otherwise, they will they will not attend these negotiations. So I think, of course, this negotiation from Iranian side, I think they have a concerns. U.S. is not following those promises which they made a promise in the last minute meeting. So they again and again breaking the promises, and especially President Trump's statements again and again in the TV, in the social media. So these statements and Iranian breaking the promises that disturb the negotiation. So of course, this is a severe risk for Pakistan, such as of course Pakistan is neighboring country of Iran. Pakistan and Saudi Arabia have a defense pact, and Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries have a American bases. When again any war started in this region, the Pakistan maybe Pakistan will be from the Saudi Arabian side, and maybe Pakistan will become a party, but it is not in this stage, because Pakistan is a foreign policy's main thing is that Pakistan will not interfere in intra-Muslim conflict. So this is intra-Muslim conflict because Iran and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan played a role to like Saudi Arabia and Qatar should not retaliate Iranians attacks, because Iran attacked on American military bases, because these countries had a military basis. So first thing, and second thing is Strait of Hormuz. Pakistan's totally dependent on Strait of Hormuz, not Pakistan. Even other regional players such as China is mainly dependent, not mainly, but it's a main portion of the oil coming from the Strait of Hormuz. India also, some another also countries also, because another thing is. So Pakistan is also also beneficial sometimes when after the blockade of Strait of Hormuz, Dubai port is not functioning properly. So Pakistani ports right now, Karachi port, and especially Karachi port and Port Qasim and other ports, they have so many ships and containers. Container ship came on Pakistani ports, and there are a lot of economic benefits for Pakistan. But another part of second question of U.S.-led and China-led vision of Asian connectivity. Of course, China has a main stakeholder in this region, because China already announced $1 billion of investment and connectivity initiative in Tehran, and also Pakistan, in Pakistan under the China-Pakistan economic goal. It's a prime project of China, but after the Strait of Hormuz and the ongoing war, these all his connectivity initiatives has disturbed. But from American side, of course, Pakistan is the old ally of America, and right now Pakistan enjoying this position. At the same time, Pakistan has a good relation with America. Pakistan has a good relation with Iran, and brotherly relation with Iran, and Pakistan has a good relation with China and other regional players, even in the Gulf countries. So I think nobody can afford this talk should continue. Nobody can afford the war and this crisis.
Mm-hmm. But then, if we come to look at the feedback, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian has commended actually Pakistan for its role in mediating the ceasefire. But still, we have some Iranian officials who have reportedly expressed frustration with Islamabad's handling of the talks. So this leads me to this question. Dr. Faisal Javaid, if this process fails, does Pakistan's diplomatic capital, so carefully accumulated, risk evaporating overnight?
Yes, of course. But this we can't. Not even Pakistan. Nobody can afford. This dialogue should be failed. Everyone is have a best wishes and prayed for. This dialogue should be whole and should be successful. And my analysis is that I think Iranian side initially was ready to come and join, and even Pakistan's army chief marshal he was there, and he visited 3 days, and he convinced the Iranian leadership. And during his visit, they announced the state of Hormuz. But in American side, they initially promised that they will end the blockade of state of Hormuz, but they continue blockade the ships and movement. So when they caught the Iranian ships, so Iranian again retaliate answer, okay, you are not fulfilling the promises. So they again not coming in the dialogue. But I think maybe Pakistani side is trying. On the whole day, they have a civil calls from Pakistani side and convincing. Also, same time, the Americans leadership. Also, same time, they convincing the Iranian leadership. But American side, they are on the way. Iranian side, because they are only 2 hours away, they can join in the any time. So I think, of course. But we have same Pakistan make a bridge between actually one thing we should keep in our mind. American actually hit Iranian spiritual leader. Actually, he's the highest position in Iran. Spiritually and also constitutionally. So I think, and also since 1979, they have a worst relation. They don't have any diplomatic relation. So it's a very tough position for Pakistan and it is an easy process. In the one sitting, you can set all the things. I think it takes time. So one thing is we should maybe is okay. Both sides want to end the crisis and want to continue the diplomatic dialogue, and hopefully they will join. But nobody can afford this dialogue should be failed. But everyone want the dialogue should be successful.
Mm-hmm. Let's hope so, because what we're having here is just a ceasefire that exists on paper and a negotiation that may have only one party at the table, a naval seizure that Tehran calls piracy, and a mediator caught in the middle. It doesn't really look that promising. So let's turn to the wars within the war, the front that perhaps never fell silent. And here, let me address you, Ms. Zahra Ladha. While the world's attention has shifted to Hormuz and Islamabad, Gaza continues to bleed. The UN is saying Palestinians remain unsafe 6 months after the ceasefire announcement, with deaths and injuries continuing in homes, shelters, vehicles, also a medical facility, and even classroom. Reuters says more than 750 Palestinians have been killed since the deal took effect last October, while we can see clashes still happening. And from a political risk perspective, I want to ask, what does it mean when a ceasefire has been in place for months, but the killing continues? And why has the international community's attention shifted so completely away from Gaza, even as the body count is still rising?
Absolutely, yes. And I think what we're seeing in Gaza right now is what happens when a war ends in name, but not in practice. And Israel's continued attacks on Palestinians in Gaza have resulted in what we might call a chronic crisis. And unfortunately, once a conflict or a war becomes chronic, it drops down the international agenda. And that's what we're seeing right now. And interestingly enough, Iran watched this play out and has taken steps to avoid the same fate. Since the beginning of the war, the Iran-Israel-US war, Iran has taken steps to impose the economic cost on the international community to avoid this same outcome. So the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is actually why we're seeing now such a significant international focus on both that global waterway, but also the talks in Islamabad.
Mm-hmm. And while these killings and crimes are still happening, we can refer back to April 8th, for example, when we saw the occupation forces killing Al Jazeera journalist Mohammed Washah in a strike in Gaza City. Reuters and the UN Human Rights Office say Palestinian journalists continue to be killed at an alarming level, and CPJ says 2025 was a record year for journalist deaths. So, Ms. Zahra Ladha, at what what point does the systematic killing of aid workers and journalists under a nominal ceasefire cross the threshold from incident to policy?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have seen since late October journalists repeatedly targeted by Israel in Gaza. This has been documented by a range of organizations, including the UN and several that you mentioned yourself. And this has a significant impact not only on those who lost their lives in this war, those journalists who lost their lives in this war in Gaza, but also on journalists in other conflict zones. Israel's erosion of international norms in this regard sets a dangerous precedent for the protection of journalists across a range of conflict zones, where other states likely now feel more empowered to target these individuals.
And I want to continue talking about these deliberate targeting of those who are trying to document these crimes. And here, let me bring back Mr. Giso Antonio Baez. Mr. Baez, if we come to look at the crimes happening, and as I mentioned earlier, on April 8th, the occupation military said it had struck a journalist in Gaza. Al Jazeera condemned the killing as a deliberate and targeted crime. Mohammed, according to Reuters, Mohammed Washah was among those killed, and CPJ has documented another record year for journalist deaths in conflict zones, with the Zionist entity responsible for the vast majority. From a conflict management and international humanitarian law perspective, what does the systematic targeting of journalists tell us about the broader information war being waged alongside the military campaign? And what does that say about the state of international law when those who document war crimes are themselves targeted with impunity, I must say?
I mean, it is important to reiterate the fact that under international humanitarian law, journalists are to be protected. They are considered protected civilians, and I think that's very clear to continue to highlight and to state. I mean, with 300 journalists who are, again, clearly identified as press being killed, and it's pointing to something quite systemic. And I have to say, what my colleague on the show has also mentioned in regards to how it seems that nobody is caring about international law at present, I have to unfortunately agree, because this is what we're seeing. It is becoming more than just controlling the narrative, as much as it is controlling the battlefield. It's also controlling the perception that one has for journalists. And if we look, for example, within the Trump administration, you know, the ushering of it, it has little regard for journalism beyond that which only pleases the administration itself. I mean, we see it how the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, and you can say whatever you want about her. She's impressive in how she just has a quip for everybody, but it's a quip for how she's belittling journalists on anything they're saying. It's labeling it all completely as fake news. But this goes hand in hand into what we're seeing around the world. That's starting from this administration as well too, and it's creeping into other realms. It's the little regard of journalists. It's the little regard of those working on the ground and looking for various reasons to discredit them. I mean, going back into how it's creeping to other realms, I mean, just recently we have news that, you know, the American Kuwaiti journalist Ahmed Shihab El-Ladin, who I know personally, has been instrumental in showcasing atrocities we've seen in Gaza and what's been going on in the war, and also been formidable in Al Jazeera and with Huffington Post. He has been now in prison for the past, I think now it's going on 7 weeks in Kuwait, for simply reporting on publicly available information on the war in Iran. And again, it's publicly available. Anybody could have found it. It wasn't anything secretive. But again, it was just demonstration of the fact that it's trying to keep things in a bud. Same thing even within continental Europe. There was last year an Italian journalist who was fired simply for questioning EU commissioners around accountability on Gaza, and it goes on. So we're going from jeopardizing the lives of journalists to really finding any excuse to quell them. And again, I have to repeat, under international law, journalists are protected civilians. Journalism is protected, but we are at a point where the work of this community is starting to be made redundant because of the rhetoric that is coming in. They are being vilified from a political point of view, and it's becoming a proper dangerous point because we are weakening the people that are documenting war and documenting the history that we need to hold those accountable.
And if you come to look at it closer, the Committee to Protect Journalists, for example, has repeatedly called for independent investigations into these killings. And yet again, no meaningful accountability has been materialized. Now, does the failure to protect journalists or prosecute their killers signal a fundamental collapse of the protections that international humanitarian law is supposed to provide for these people?
And I think you highlighted something very important. You said supposed to, and that's something that everyone needs to understand, is the fact that international law only works when it's enforced. There isn't a global police force that's policing everyone and making sure that everybody complies. And that's apparent because right now it isn't being enforced. And again, I go back to what my colleague on the panel has mentioned, that no one's really caring about international law. And that's the tragedy of it all. And it is worrying because political rhetoric is now undermining journalists. Public distrust is growing, and it's feeding this manner in which one undermines journalism. And it's now physically targeting them not only in conflict zones, but in completely random circumstances, such as the case of Ahmed el-Din in Kuwait. So it's demonstrating how journalists are not only expendable, but being classified as the villain. But it's also showing a very dangerous global precedence, the fact that anything goes. If you can quash the journalist from what they're saying, or you can vilify them at a certain point, despite international what it says, what does this mean on other realms? And that's, again, what we're seeing, both in warfare with with Ukraine, with what's going on right now in the Strait of Hormuz, and so on and so forth.
And since you brought the colleague who mentioned that, let me bring him back, Dr. Salvador. Let's turn this time to Lebanon, where a separate ceasefire is already under strain. So if we look at the reports, Reuters is saying the Zionist entity is entrenching its hold over territory despite a U.S.-mediated 10-day ceasefire. The war has killed nearly 2,300 people in Lebanon since March 2nd, and both sides are already trading accusations over violations. Now, from a geopolitical perspective, what does this pattern, ceasefires announced and immediately tested, tell us really about the credibility of the ceasefire architecture in this conflict, and what message does it tend to Tehran about the value of any American guarantees in a potential deal?
You know, it's very simple. I mean, repeated ceasefire violations show that they are not really peace mechanism. So they are tactical pauses in ongoing conflict. So if commitments are not respected on one front, Iran has a little insensitive to honor them elsewhere. And reciprocity is the foundation of any deal. This is the reality of the situation. I mean, you cannot, in this kind of situation, if nobody is respecting at some point, ceasefires, there is no peace mechanism. And this is a problem today. I mean, the key question is who wants the peace? So do we really believe U.S., is in good faith and wants to, creating an area of negotiation? I don't believe so. I mean, we are at the start, unfortunately, of a real, serious crisis. And at the end of the day, I mean, when you see the situation since months now, I mean, U.S. have no solutions to get out of this, this crisis. So if you have a look on the Lebanon, all the region, I mean, you have no solutions of a ceasefire. So it will go up and I'm very worried about the next coming weeks and the next coming months, how it's going to be.
Since you're worried about that, I would like to know more about your concerns. So, when we have, for example, Iran's parliament speaker who listing actually violations of the Truce plan, including continued attacks in Lebanon and denial of Iran's right to enrichment. Now, if the US-Israeli side cannot or will not honor the Lebanon component of the ceasefire, what incentive does Tehran have to honor its commitment on Hormuz or uranium for that matter?
I mean, Iran, they are prepared for, 40 years about this situation. It's always a question, of knowing, the past and the history. Americans, as usual, and especially Trump administration, for different, mainly the main reason it's a deal, to create an amazing, craziness in this region, and they didn't understand at some point that these people, they were ready to resist, and they know very well, their land. They know very well at some point the region, and they have the land for themselves. So, now we are in a situation that everything at some point is blocked, because the Americans, they don't want to lose the face, and the Iranian, they can last. In this kind of situation, in this kind of war. So, what is going to be the solution at the end of the day? We will have an escalation in the conflict, and we can see already day after day, how it goes regarding the Strait of Hormuz, for instance. In one hand, we have some propaganda saying everything is fine. We will deblock the Strait of Hormuz. This is in the European side. And in the other side, they can manage everything they want. So this is the situation we are at some point. And there is no real solution. So that's the reason I'm worried. I'm worried about the escalation.
Thank you, Professor. Now, let's turn to Dr. Javaid, and maybe we can widen the lens to the broader regional theater, including the Houthi front that continues to stretch U.S. naval power. So, Dr. Faisal Javaid, reports from U.S. naval sources show the USS George H.W. Bush sailing around Africa rather than taking the usual Red Sea route as carriers avoid Houthi threats in the region. Now, from a strategic perspective, what does it signal when the world's most powerful navy must reroute an aircraft carrier thousands of miles to avoid a non-state actor armed with Iranian-supplied missiles and drones? And what does this tell us actually about the changing character of naval power in the 21st century in general?
Actually, of course, Houthi is a non-state actors in Yemen, so is affiliated with the Iranian state. I think they have very good relation, and they in the past they attacked the civil attack on American ships and other and even Israel. So that's why the ship they took thousands of miles away, and they don't want to escalate the conflict. But of course, it's not think naval where everything will change. But in some, this is not evidence of U.S. naval decline. America still feels the only true blue water global navy. Still feels the only global navy capable of simultaneously major operations. But I think they don't want to escalate the conflict because they want to follow the ceasefire. They have only 1 day away and they also want to put pressure on actually dialogue on Iran. They should come on the table.
Mhm. And meanwhile, we can see that a lot of pressure is being exercised on the United States. I mean, we can see that its blockade has not actually achieved the stated objectives of forcing Tehran to capitulate, for example. Now, is the United States winning this confrontation according to you, or is it being strategically bled by actors who can absorb punishment and continue fighting?
I think both parties stated and said because they have a domestic pressure and same America, they have a midterm election and also in the Iranian side. The Iranian side since 1979 they stated all the times and a big evil of America and Israel. So how is it possible you can say everything will be normalized in that? But no party is winning. But in war is not good for both parties. But both parties is are claiming that we are winning, and America is not winning, or we cannot say America is losing because actually America is not. If I say not controlling, actually the crisis is not under control. The things which actually initially they started and said we will change the regime. We will the stated objective they could not fulfill because the Iranian side resisted unprecedentedly, and they closed the Strait of Hormuz. They put pressure on, and all Middle East states are facing problem because they have a American military bases. If they don't have a military bases, maybe they don't face in all these kind of attacks.
Thank you so much. So the bottom line, let's say, across Gaza, Lebanon, and the Red Sea, we're seeing a pattern. Ceasefires announced, violations documented, and a legal order that seems unable to respond. So let's just turn to the economic consequences that are rippling far beyond the Middle East. And here I bring back Ms. Zahra Ladha. The IMF has issued a really stark warning. In its worst case scenario, for example, it says that the global economy teeters on the brink of recession, with oil prices averaging $110 a barrel in 2026 and $125 a barrel in 2027. The fund has also sharply cut its Middle East growth forecast, with several Gulf economies now expected to contract. So, according to you, and from a political risk perspective, which economies are most vulnerable to this energy shock, and what are the likely political consequences in Europe, Asia, and the global South if oil remains above $100 a barrel?
Absolutely. And of course, energy shocks will be felt differently across different regions. They're definitely felt more acutely in import-dependent economies, for example, in South Asia, where higher oil prices feed directly into inflation and risk sparking unrest in these countries. If we look to Europe now, the impact is definitely more political. Of course, higher energy costs means that everything else becomes more expensive, including transports, food, etc., putting pressure on average households, but of course on governments that are already grappling with cost of living crises in those countries. But it is worth mentioning that it's not just oil or energy importing countries that face these risks. Oil exporters also face similar risks. And a very good example of this is Iraq. So Iraq's government revenues, 90% of them come directly from Iraq's oil exports. And any disruption to production or export, as we're seeing right now with the de facto closure of the Strait of Hormuz, impacts the government's ability to pay public sector salaries. And in a system like Iraq, where a lot of people are dependent on government salaries, this poses a real risk of instability in those countries. So again, the risk is not distributed by who's importing oil or who's exporting oil, but actually how resilient those systems are to these kind of shocks.
And it's interesting that you mentioned Iraq because the IMF is saying Iran, Bahrain, Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar are now expected to contract. So, is this war perhaps economically devastating the Middle East while leaving the United States relatively insulated in the short term?
I think it's a good way to put it, and I think a lot of think tanks have said similar things, namely Chatham House. The US is a moderately net energy exporter, so they are relatively insulated, especially compared to some economies in Europe and, of course, in the Gulf right now, given the situation. But there are political ramifications to this conflict. Of course, the average American consumer isn't protected from these price increases, and that affects how domestic politics play out. But there's also a risk that a continued conflict and a continued economic crisis for Washington's allies actually puts strain on Washington's ability to maintain its relations as they stand with the international community. And that's what we're seeing start to play out, particularly among Washington's European allies that are footing the cost of this war much more than Washington is at the moment.
Thank you, indeed. And now, let me bring back Mr. Baiz. Let's talk a little bit about the mechanism driving this economic shock, the energy supply disruption. $200 per barrel for oil. Analysts are warning of catastrophic scenario. So the IEA, for example, is saying global oil demand is now expected to contract in 2026 as the Iran war ends, the market outlook. And Reuters also reports the Strait of Hormuz disruption has already sent prices sharply higher. So from a risk management perspective again, how should cooperations and governments be positioning for the possibility of sustained, let's say, triple-digit oil prices? And what does the extreme sensitivity of global markets to this single choke point tell us about the vulnerability of the world economy?
This is something what we would call a concentration risk. And in this case, it's that too much of the world's energy demands really flow from one narrow route, in this case, the Strait of Hormuz. So obviously, when anything happens to that, the entire global economy can feel immediately. Because again, we have 20% of global LNG trade depending on that route. Roughly 1/5 of global oil passes through the Hormuz daily, pre this conflict, of course. And as obviously indicated, a single disruption could even push beyond a $200 per barrel. So it's evident because of that 1 hour route and how much everything is so constricted to it. So even a short disruption at any point, even if it wasn't this conflict, it can make global markets act within hours, not just days. So if you're looking at taking a step back from a business, from governments, for business, obviously they'll be thinking about diversification, expanding supplier networks, ideally beyond the Gulf, but that's something they have to really think strategically on. Investing in alternative shipping routes, but also using financial hedging really to protect against price volatility. We're seeing companies really rethink supply chains to really reduce single points of failure. For governments, it's going to be different. It's going to be the focus on releasing or maybe even replenishing strategic reserves, deepening energy partnerships with regions beyond the Gulf, with North Africa, with the US, even and beyond, and accelerating investments in renewables, and not with the climate goals in mind at all, but more around for energy security. And that can take things different and a completely different dynamic when one thinks about what that can lead to with other dynamics, with critical minerals and electric vehicles. But the bottom line is, ultimately what we're seeing is that the global economy I wouldn't say it's structurally fragile, it's just a very strong indicator of how we really depend on each other. We cannot be living with like an ostrich with its head in the sand. One small thing really affects us all. We are all connected to each other. And I think ultimately, despite the tragedies that we're seeing, the distress that this is causing us all, it's showing that globalization worked. We really do belong to each other. And when one piece of it is cut, we are all bleeding from it. And in this case, one disruption in one corridor really destabilizes everything.
But then there are some lucky ones, and the unfortunate ones, and the most unfortunate are the ones being bombed, of course, and the ones who are feeling inflation. Let's say they are the most fortunate. But then, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Projects, that energy importers, including most of Europe, Japan, Korea, and much of emerging Asia, face a squeeze on real incomes. Now, given Europe's heavy dependence on energy imports, do you think the EU is the one paying an especially high price for a war that serves primarily Israeli strategic interests?
I mean, something to keep in mind is the fact that the EU, yes, Europe is exposed, but not unevenly, and there is variance within the European Union. I think my colleague as well too, Dr. Zohra, kind of highlighted this as well too. Countries like Italy and Spain have diversified. Spain particularly is extremely reliant. I mean, they have a pipeline from North Africa. They have the largest LNG regasification. So the real pressure is really going to be coming on mainly with Northern Europe, for example, Germany or the UK, where industrial demand and dependency is exponentially higher. I mean, being in the UK, this resonates extremely because we see it in the prices that we see with heating our homes or on every aspect. And it's already been up since COVID. The fact that it's going to go up further it puts pressure on everybody. And obviously, personally, for those who plan for geopolitical risk, they're going to be holding up better. For example, those who be able to look at this and see, okay, how to react. It was Italy with Giorgia Meloni, who went immediately into Qatar to try to demonstrate the fact that committed to the opening of Hormuz, but also with gas and really trying to act in her own sovereign way. So the crisis is exposing who was prepared and who didn't. And I think that's really important to understand.
And this leads me to perhaps another angle. Dr. Salvador, let's examine the broader geopolitical implications of this energy crisis. I mean, if we come to look at it, China has now intervened directly, expressing concern over the forced interception of the Iranian flag Tosca by U.S. forces. Beijing also called for restraint and for ships to resume passage normally through the Strait. From a geopolitical perspective, what does China's intervention signal about Beijing's strategic interest in this conflict? And is China positioning itself as a neutral mediator, a protector of Iranian interests, or a defender of the principle of freedom of navigation? What is it really?
I mean, China, at the end of the day, is very pragmatical. I mean, China wants stability, secure trade routes, and to counterbalance U.S. influence, not to defend Iran unconditionally. China and Russia support Iran, that's clear, but only up to a point. And Iran's real leverage lies in its ability to raise the cost of conflict. So especially through energy and regional disruption. So if we are making a brief summary, China is watching the situation, but at the end of the day doesn't want to disturb his own business. So this is a China position at the end of the day.
Thank you indeed. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of our special coverage for tonight. I would have loved to give every single one of you a final word at least, but unfortunately, we don't have the time to do that. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. If the war itself is illegal under international law, what legitimacy can any agreement or negotiated agreement under its shadow possibly claim? These were one of the most important points we discussed tonight. And until next time, have a good one.